These same terrorists are searching for weapons of mass destruction, the tools to turn their hatred into Holocaust. This threat cannot be ignored. This threat cannot be appeased.
Now, like all of you, my responsibility is to act in the interests of my nation and my people, and I will never apologize for defending those interests.
We also ask that every peacekeeping mission have clearly defined goals and metrics for evaluating success. They deserve to see the value in the United Nations, and it is our job to show it to them.
President Trump at the UN ahead of a big speech tomorrow there. He said the U.S. will help make the UN great. Not great again, but said great. What about this change from candidate Trump? Now ahead of this big speech, let's bring in our panel. Jonah Goldberg, senior editor at National Review. Susan Page, Washington bureau chief at USA Today. And Matt Schlapp, contributor with The Hill. Matt, clearly it's a different sounding President Trump than candidate Trump when it comes to the UN.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think is a good sign is that he's not just dissing the UN, he's engaging the UN on how it can reform itself. The UN has many programs that have been managed well, but they have some disastrous scandals as well. And I think he's trying to be candid with them about if each nation pursues what's in that nation's own interests, but they can find common interests around the globe, the UN can play a vital role. But it has to stop rewarding all the rogue actors and bad actors. We have big problems with China. Obviously, this North Korea problem has been kicked down the road, as H.R. McMaster says, long enough, so long that there's no road left. And the nation faces this horrible prospect of Iran having a nuclear weapon.
Obviously, North Korea, Susan, and Iran will take center stage, but it is interesting to look at the stats here. The top 10 nations funding the UN in 2017, the U.S., $610 million at 22%. You see the rest of them. Japan is closest at 9.68%.
You know, the complaints by President Trump that the U.S. is carrying too much of the load, there's too much bureaucracy, there's too much corruption in the UN. This is a message that previous presidents have also sounded, but because he was so harshly critical of the United Nations during the campaign and since, and because he's just by his nature a disruptive figure, I think they're taking it more seriously than they took with some previous presidents, and maybe it'll have some effect on this. You know, he's on these issues, I think he is on the same ground as his predecessors were, who had complaints about the UN, but also saw a role for the United Nations. And that's also something you heard him articulate today.
He's clearly in recent weeks touted the UN Security Council and these unanimous votes they've managed to get through, albeit watered down some of these resolutions.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And look, I agreed more with candidate Trump about the UN. I think the UN is a really flawed institution, but it's the only global institution we've got. And once you're president, you actually have to work with the institutions and the tools that you have. And that means having to temper some of the rhetoric that you might have used on the campaign trail. But, you know, let's be clear. I should fully disclose, I'm sort of in the same camp as Matt. My wife works for Nikki Haley at the UN, so I have those issues. But
no wonder Nikki Haley's doing such a good job.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Well, thank you for the full disclosure.
Yeah, no, I wanted to do the full disclosure. But, you know, look, like the UN Human Rights Council is a hive of scum and villainy and has been for decades. Every bad actor in the world flocks to be on it so that they can deflect criticism of themselves and aim it entirely at Israel. A lot of that stuff does need to be reformed. And, you know, if Donald Trump has to tack a little bit and be presidential and not go guns a-blazing, I think that's fine.
All right, let's talk about the speech tomorrow and what may be in it, what likely will be in it. It is a big moment, Susan, for this president, much like the Saudi Arabia trip was, much like the joint address to Congress was. Here, the Russian president, the Chinese president aren't there. He's center stage.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, when you look at this week, 4 days focused on foreign policy, I bet this is the most sustained attention President Trump has had on foreign policy issues alone during his presidency, probably during his lifetime. You know, this is a really sustained period where he's focused on these issues. And we know that the speech to the General Assembly is a chance to articulate your big vision for the world. So we're going to look to see how he translates America First into the policies that he would want to pursue as president.
Let's take a listen to the Secretary of State on North Korea pressure.
We'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about that with many international leaders. And I think the UN Security Council resolutions really speak for themselves, a unanimous view of
That last question was the New York Times report that North Korea rocket fuel came from Russia and China, and said he didn't have any comment. They're walking a line here, but their talk is kind of coming to an end on North Korea.
Yeah, I find what's really interesting is that you have H.R. McMaster over and over again saying publicly that there are military options that are on the table and that are feasible. It seems like they're not just saying all options are on the table. They keep focusing on the fact that I want to make it very clear that there are military options on the table. And I think that reflects reality. I think the White House is dealing with the fact that they were handed a policy that the last 3 or 4 administrations didn't want to make a decision on because they had the time to put it off. There's no more time left. And I do think it's interesting what Susan said. I love the president's rhetoric on the UN. I find the UN to be mostly a useless organization that costs a lot of money and the average Joe pays the bills. But if any president actually could take advantage of things like UNGA, it's President Trump and his team, because there are so many big problems around the globe.
He's often talked about redoing the UN, including the marble. I wonder what's the over-under on the marble making it into the speech tomorrow. I'd take the under.
Oh, yeah.